Jessica Hartman boarded Flight 227 like any other first-class passenger, but within minutes. Her polished smile and designer handbag would ignite a chaos no one on the plane would forget. It started out like any other busy travel morning at Los Angeles International Airport. The terminal buzzed with the usual mix of tired families juggling strollers, business travelers glued to their phones, and tourists already snapping photos of the departure board. Flight 127 to New York was boarding at Gate 34, a standard cross-country trip that most passengers hoped would be long but uneventful. People shuffled forward, scanning their boarding passes, adjusting carry-ons, and eyeing the clock. It was the type of flight where everyone silently wished for peace and quiet, and then she appeared. A tall woman in her late 40s, polished to perfection, carrying herself with the kind of confidence that drew attention whether people wanted to give it or not. Her outfit was sharp designer blazer, oversized sunglasses, and a handbag worth more than most people's monthly rent. She walked with quick, clipped steps, as though she was racing against time, yet she was among the first to board thanks to her first-class ticket. The gate agents greeted her, but she barely nodded, handing over her boarding pass without a word. From the start, her presence was commanding in a way that was hard to ignore. As she stepped onto the plane, her expectations were obvious. She placed her handbag into the overhead compartment with a sharp snap, adjusted her seat with visible irritation, and immediately requested bottled water before even buckling in. The crew, used to demanding travelers, responded politely, assuming she was simply particular. But small hints suggested something else. The way she looked at other passengers boarding, as though judging who belonged in her space. The way she fidgeted when the flight attendant didn't move quickly enough. These little details didn't cause much alarm at first, but they created an uneasy undercurrent. Around her, other first-class passengers settled into their seats. A man in a suit was already flipping through a stack of papers. A mother with a baby cradled her child, shushing softly. Across the aisle, two college students laughed about their trip to New York. It was an ordinary slice of life, a random mix of people all sharing the same enclosed space for the next several hours. Most wanted nothing more than a safe takeoff, a meal, maybe a nap, and a smooth landing. But the energy around this particular passenger felt different, like a storm cloud hovering where the air should have been calm. As the plane filled, she pressed the call button again, asking for a blanket. Then, moments later, she requested another water, this time with ice. She complained that the seatbelt was uncomfortable. Each request, though seemingly minor, carried an edge of impatience. The crew exchanged brief glances, but continued to serve her with the kind of practiced professionalism that comes from dealing with all sorts of personalities at 30,000 feet. Other passengers noticed, too, some rolling their eyes discreetly, others whispering under their breath. The flight hadn't even left the ground, and already this woman was setting the tone. By the time the doors closed and the captain announced their departure, a quiet tension hung in the cabin. Outside, the California sun bathed the runway in gold as the plane began to taxi. Inside, there was a sense that this wouldn't be the easy-going flight most had expected. At that moment, nobody could predict just how far things would spiral or how one woman's behavior would turn a routine trip into a headline-making disaster. As the plane climbed into the sky, the woman's behavior began to intensify. The hum of the engines and the occasional bump from turbulence seemed to feed her sense of unease, though other passengers barely noticed the slight jolts. She tapped her fingers impatiently on the armrest, frowning at the flight attendants as they moved down the aisle, offering drinks and checking on passengers. Every small delay or minor oversight seemed to provoke a sharp reaction. She asked for an extra pillow, then complained the blanket was too thin. She requested a change in seat position, claiming the angle was uncomfortable, and frowned when the attendant hesitated. What might have been minor gripes from a typical passenger quickly became an escalating storm, drawing attention from everyone nearby. Her requests were not simply persistent, they carried an edge of authority, a demand rather than a polite question. When the flight attendants brought a menu for the meal service, she immediately expressed dissatisfaction with the options, claiming she could not eat anything on the list and requesting a special dish that was not offered on board. The crew attempted to handle the situation with calm professionalism, explaining gently that the meals were standard, yet she shook her head and sighed loudly, as if the explanation were an insult. Her frustration radiated outward, turning heads from neighboring seats. People tried to ignore her at first, focusing on their phones, books, or conversations, but it was difficult to escape the tension she created. At one point, a fellow passenger accidentally reached into the aisle to adjust a bag, brushing against her arm. She reacted immediately, her voice rising in anger, claiming she had been assaulted and accusing the person of intentional disrespect. The cabin, which had moments before been filled with quiet murmurs and soft clicks of electronic devices, suddenly grew tense. Some passengers whispered nervously, others glanced at the crew, unsure of how the situation would unfold. The atmosphere had shifted from mere discomfort to a sense of potential conflict. Flight attendants stepped closer, trying to mediate and calm her down, but each intervention seemed to fuel her agitation further. As the hours passed, her behavior grew more erratic. She complained about the temperature repeatedly, insisting it was either too hot or too cold depending on the moment. She demanded the window shade be fully opened, then closed repeatedly, citing the glare from the sun and the darkness interfering with her ability to read. The constant motion and unpredictability of her demands made it nearly impossible for the crew to maintain normal service, and passengers began exchanging uneasy glances. Some discreetly recorded her outbursts, sensing the potential for something unusual, while others silently prayed for a smooth remainder of the flight. By the midpoint of the journey, even minor turbulence triggered extreme reactions. She accused the pilot of being incompetent and unsafe, her voice rising above the cabin's ambient noise. People clutched their armrests nervously, some closing their eyes to avoid witnessing the unfolding spectacle. What had begun as a series of small complaints had escalated into a full-blown disturbance, and there was a growing realization that the situation could not continue without intervention. The crew exchanged urgent glances, recognizing that this was no ordinary passenger issue, and quietly began to formulate a plan to keep the cabin safe while managing the unpredictable storm that had settled over first class. As the flight progressed, the woman's behavior became increasingly unpredictable, and subtle details began to emerge that raised serious concerns. The flight attendants noticed her movements were jittery, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled with her handbag and seatbelt. There was a faint smell of alcohol when she opened a small flask hidden inside her bag, and she sipped it intermittently, carefully hiding it from view. Even at cruising altitude, the mixture of alcohol and prescription medications seemed to affect her judgment and mood, amplifying her irritation and suspicion. She glared at the crew with mounting intensity, accusing them of ignoring her requests on purpose or deliberately delaying service. Her complaints were no longer just about comfort, they had a sharp, hostile edge, as though she believed the world was conspiring against her. Passengers around her began noticing the odd behavior. A woman across the aisle quietly commented to her companion that the first-class passenger seemed agitated in a way that went beyond ordinary frustration. A man scrolling through his phone noticed her sudden outburst when a blanket arrived later than she expected. She snapped at the attendant, raising her voice, insisting that they were deliberately disrespecting her. The calm rhythm of the flight had been shattered, replaced by a tense, uneasy energy that seemed to hum throughout the cabin. Everyone felt the unpredictability, the sense that a small incident could ignite an even bigger confrontation. What started as impatience was now slipping into something more alarming. At one point, she began pacing the small space between her seat and the window, muttering complaints under her breath and occasionally glaring at anyone who glanced her way. Her eyes darted rapidly, her hands clenching and unclenching in a nervous pattern that made the flight attendants uneasy. She accused other passengers of staring at her, whispering that they were plotting something, though nobody had done anything. Her paranoia was growing, invisible yet palpable, affecting everyone nearby. Crew members whispered to each other, aware that the situation was escalating beyond simple customer service challenges. The first hints of danger were no longer subtle, they were manifest in her sudden bursts of anger, her refusal to sit down, and her demands that nothing on the plane met her expectations. Even minor turbulence became a trigger. A slight bump in the cabin sent her into a panic, pointing at the ceiling and accusing the pilot of reckless flying. She called attention to every sound and movement around her, amplifying ordinary flight noises into evidence of a conspiracy. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some covering their ears, others watching cautiously to see what she would do next. The crew tried everything in their toolkit to calm her, speaking in measured tones and offering reassurances, but her erratic mood swings made communication nearly impossible. Each attempt to reason with her seemed to spark new complaints and sharper accusations. As the flight approached the halfway mark, it became clear to the captain and senior crew that the situation had crossed a line. Her behavior was no longer simply disruptive, it had become a safety concern. Other passengers were anxious, some actively recording the disturbances on their phones, sensing that the unfolding drama might be remarkable. The crew quietly began alerting authorities on the ground, preparing for an intervention upon landing. The woman, unaware of the growing preparations, continued her dramatic and volatile display, unknowingly setting the stage for a confrontation that would soon make headlines and turn a routine flight into a moment of shocking infamy. 2 hours into the flight, the captain made the decision to divert to Denver. The announcement over the intercom was calm but firm, explaining that due to a medical and safety concern, the plane would be landing at the nearest airport. Some passengers murmured nervously, exchanging glances that reflected a mix of relief and curiosity. Others immediately pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The first-class woman, however, reacted as though the announcement was a personal attack. Her hands flew to the armrests, her face flushed with anger, and she began pacing again, her muttered accusations now louder and more frantic. The cabin, once filled with the low hum of the engines and quiet conversations, was now thick people with tension. Every small sound seemed magnified, suitcases shifting in the overhead bins, the rustle of newspapers, even the subtle click of a belt buckle. The woman accused the crew of deliberately plotting to embarrass her in front of other passengers, pointing at the attendants as if they were conspiring. Her demands became impossible to satisfy. She insisted the flight be redirected to her preferred destination, claiming she could not possibly land in Denver. Crew members remained composed, repeating the explanation about safety and compliance with regulations, but each word seemed to fuel her growing fury. Passengers nearby began to feel the intensity of the situation firsthand. A family tried to comfort their children, whispering reassurances that everything would be fine. Business travelers glanced nervously at the unfolding scene, gripping armrests as the woman's behavior escalated. She moved her chair abruptly, spilling a drink onto the floor, and then insisted someone clean it immediately, berating the attendants for the delay. Her agitation was contagious. Other passengers whispered in low tones, some shaking their heads, others capturing the scene on their phones. The confined space of the aircraft made the tension unavoidable. There was no escaping the storm of her anger and paranoia. As the plane began its descent into Denver, the woman's behavior reached a new level of intensity. She stood suddenly, pointing at the emergency exit and claiming she would not cooperate unless she received immediate attention. Flight attendants attempted to calm her, speaking softly but firmly, but she ignored them, moving through the aisle in a way that blocked other passengers. Her erratic movements and loud complaints drew the eyes of everyone on board, creating a sense of unease that filled the cabin. The crew coordinated silently, preparing for a controlled intervention the moment the plane touched the ground. When the wheels finally hit the runway, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Some passengers closed their eyes, exhaling after the tense flight. Others glanced at the first-class woman with a mix of apprehension and disbelief, witnessing the magnitude of her meltdown. Ground staff and officers were already positioned at the gate, ready to manage the situation. What had been a routine flight transformed into a high-stakes scenario, with all eyes fixed on the approaching confrontation. The stage was set for a dramatic ending, one that would leave a lasting impression on everyone involved. The moment the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. Ground officers had already positioned themselves strategically, knowing the passenger was volatile and unpredictable. The first-class woman, however, seemed unaware of the coordinated presence waiting for her. She continued pacing, her voice rising as she insisted that the situation was a mistake and that she had done nothing wrong. Her eyes darted around the cabin, scanning for anyone she believed might be complicit in what she imagined was an elaborate plot against her. The crew urged her to remain seated, speaking in calm, authoritative tones, but she refused to comply, her panic and anger escalating with each passing second. The officers moved in, approaching her with caution. She clutched her handbag tightly, swinging it in front of her like a shield, while shouting accusations and demanding her rights. Other passengers froze in their seats, some capturing the spectacle on their phones, others shielding their faces, unsure of what would happen next. The confined space of the airplane aisle left little room for maneuver, making the standoff feel even more tense. Her resistance was immediate and forceful. She pulled against the officers, refused to stand, and leaned back into her seat, trying to prevent them from taking control. Each move only intensified the struggle, making it clear that this would not be a simple escort off the plane. As the officers attempted to restrain her, she thrashed, kicked, and shouted, drawing attention from everyone in the cabin. Flight attendants worked to clear the aisle and ensure that passengers remained safe, while some reached for phones to document the unusual scene unfolding before them. The woman's designer heels scraped harshly against the carpet as she was lifted from her seat, her protests echoing through the cabin. It was a chaotic moment, both physical and psychological, with onlookers unable to look away even as the reality of the situation sank in. Her entitlement and panic collided, creating a spectacle that would quickly be shared across social media and news outlets alike. Finally, after several tense minutes, the officers managed to secure her safely. She was led down the aisle, still shouting and resisting, while passengers watched in stunned silence. The cabin slowly began to regain its usual order, though the air was thick with the memory of what had just occurred. Some passengers whispered among themselves, recounting the details they had witnessed, while others simply stared at the empty first-class seat, still processing the dramatic confrontation. The crew worked diligently to calm the atmosphere, moving methodically through the cabin and restoring a sense of safety. Within hours, videos of the incident had spread online, earning headlines and becoming a viral sensation. The woman's first-class meltdown, the resistance, and the dramatic removal captured the public imagination, symbolizing the extreme consequences of unchecked privilege and reckless behavior. What began as a routine flight had ended in chaos, transforming a simple journey into a story that would be told repeatedly, both as a cautionary tale and as an example of how quickly ordinary situations can spiral into unforgettable moments of public spectacle. The memory of that flight would linger long after the passengers left the airport, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it.